Israel is famous for its innovative approach to literally everything it undertakes. This is especially true when it comes to working with water, because the country's geographical features leave no other option. Water networks comprised of many kilometers of pipes, canals, tunnels, and reservoirs, water treatment plants, Israel has it all because there is no other way to manage it. And although water is an incredibly valuable resource, Israel constantly pours enormous quantities of it into the desert. Of course, the country isn't going to create a humanitarian crisis by wasting precious water anywhere. It's much more interesting than that. Now let's try to find out what's really going on there. This is the Negev desert in Israel. The conditions there are more or less the same as in other harsh deserts around the world. The average daily maximum temperature ranges from 31.5 to 25.7 degrees Celsius, depending on the area of the desert. The average daily minimum ranges from 19.4 to 14.2 degrees Celsius. However, at certain times of the year, the Negev can get so hot that it's unbearable, with temperatures reaching almost 50 degrees Celsius in the summer months. And what about rainfall? It's a typical desert, so precipitation is scarce. In the southern part of the Negev, the situation is particularly dire. Traditionally, there is no rain at all in the summer, and the rest of the year the figure reaches a maximum of 5 millimeters. The average annual rainfall is 24 millimeters. In the northern part, the situation is better. There's hardly any rain in the summer, but at other times of the year, rainfall can reach 40 or 50 millimeters, an incredibly high figure for this region. The annual average in this part of the Negev exceeds 200 millimeters. By comparison, the Sahara Desert receives about 100 millimeters of rainfall per year, so the northern Negev is still fortunate. As for the desert's topography, it's mostly sand dunes that can reach 30 meters in height, along with rocky, dusty mountains and deep craters. Vegetation is still sparse, though it does attempt to be more varied thanks to small shrubs and the occasional low-lying tree. Do you know what the worst thing about the Negev desert is for Israel? Well, let's see. The country's territory covers only about 21,000 square kilometers. That's very small. To be more precise, Israel ranks 148th in the world in terms of land area. Meanwhile, the Negev desert has an incredible expanse of 13,000 square kilometers. That is, an area of sand and stone with sparse vegetation that covers more than half of the country's land area. In such a situation, Israel definitely had to come up with something to develop an area that was normally unusable. Even David Ben-Gurion, a very important figure in Israeli history, stated unequivocally that the Negev had to be developed. Ben-Gurion did not live to see the radical changes, yet the desert was transformed. This would not have been possible if the country had not begun supplying the desert regions with a massive amount of water. Specifically, the Israelis began supplying the Negev through their national water system. The main task of the project, completed in 1964, was to pump water from Israel's largest reservoir, the Sea of Galilee, to the densely populated center and the arid south of the country. To achieve this, a system with a total length of approximately 130 kilometers was created, consisting of giant pipes, open canals, tunnels, reservoirs, and large pumping stations, capable of pumping up to 72,000 cubic meters per hour, or 7 million cubic meters of water per day. At first glance, it may seem that the system does not actually supply water to the Negev. The pipeline only runs through the western part of the desert. However, this is only the main pipeline, and there are numerous secondary branches. They venture deeper into the desert and arrive, for example, at Beersheba, a city of over 200,000 inhabitants. Incidentally, it's one of the 10 most populated cities in the country. Yes, hundreds of thousands of people live in a desert city in Israel. This is a great indicator of how developed the water supply system is, of how much it helps people forget that home is somewhere among the desert dunes, where only a few camels and nomads can survive normally. This is how water was supplied to the desert until the Sea of Galilee catchment basin was affected by drought. The level of the freshwater resource was constantly monitored, and it was decided to conserve it through desalination plants. Here they are, shown on the map, along with the national water system. Their capacity starts at 90 million cubic meters of desalinated water and reaches 150 million cubic meters at the most advanced station, called Sorek. As a result, the Israelis have connected each of the stations to the main water system using infrastructure worth $250 million. The Sea of Galilee has begun to be replenished with water from the Mediterranean, and the arid south, that is, the Negev desert region, has been saturated with millions of cubic meters of water that until recently was unusable. Incidentally, Israel's main water pipeline is not only a gigantic piece of infrastructure, but also an effective solution. Water losses are only 3%. By comparison, in Great Britain this figure reaches 20%, in Bulgaria 50%, and in Romania 70%. So virtually every liter of Mediterranean water that has been desalinated is used for its intended purpose. Furthermore, the Negev gets its water from underground, specifically from the mountain aquifer. Its safe yield, that is, the amount of water that can be extracted without damage, is about 360 million cubic meters per year. However, Israel as a whole does not have large water resources, and the Negev even less so. Therefore, starting in 2023, twice that amount will be pumped from the aquifer, approximately 600 million cubic meters of water. Pumping large amounts of water from aquifers is generally very dangerous because they don't have time to recharge and can be completely depleted, especially in Israel's climate. But an underground water source has another problem. Just below it lies a mass of salt water that can contaminate the fresh water on the horizon. For this reason, the country and the Negev desert will increasingly focus on high-tech desalination instead of pumping, which will make the underground water source safer. And the last remaining water source supplying Israel and the Negev desert is already used water. Since the 2000s, the country has invested over $750 million in this area, establishing 67 large recycling facilities, 10 of which will recover more than 56% of the wastewater collected nationwide. Imagine, 87% of all the water Israelis pour down the drain is transformed into something that can be reused. This is a very high figure compared, for example, to the United States, where the figure doesn't even exceed 10%. Israel's largest wastewater treatment plant is Shabdan, located in the Tel Aviv area. It treats approximately 367 million liters of wastewater per day, some of which is discharged into the Negev. The treated water is then transported via an aqueduct to irrigate 60% of the vegetation in this arid region. And here we finally arrive at what Israel has managed to partially transform in its arid southern territory. To begin, it's worth mentioning that desalinated, groundwater, and sewage water played a significant role in creating a forest? Yes, that's right. Part of Israel's arid desert has just been transformed into a green space where trees grow. This forest, called Yatier, is located north of the Negev desert and covers an area of 30 square kilometers. And it's indeed a record breaker, the largest planted forest in Israel. The total number of trees planted by Israelis in this area reaches an incredible 4 million. If the area hadn't been planted in this way, there would only be low-lying shrubs like Phlomis fruticosa and the Sirius tree. But now it's a forest that is 90% Aleppo pine. But planting pines and other trees here wasn't just for beauty or to create a stir. A coniferous forest on the edge of the desert? What? Yatier was planted with a much broader and more important purpose: to halt the desert's expansion, and he's succeeding. The Yatier Forest was planted 60 years ago and is still here, green, fresh, and preventing the Negev desert sands from spreading further. Moreover, the forest is literally an impenetrable wall for atmospheric carbon, meaning the trees act as a kind of carbon sink. Research has been conducted here for over 15 years, and it has been shown that the Yatier absorbs a surprising amount of unwanted carbon, as much as forests in wetter regions. Its service doesn't end there, because the Yatier Forest is also responsible for reducing the evaporation of the scarce local rainfall. The trees block the sun, preventing the rays from reaching the water. Of course, the pioneering Israelis couldn't resist using the forest for research as well. For example, Yatier is part of NASA's FluxNet project, a global network of micrometer towers used to measure the exchange of carbon dioxide, water vapor, and energy between terrestrial ecosystems and the atmosphere. There's also the Araba Institute for Environmental Studies, which studies crops like dates and grapes grown around Yatier Forest. Why? This research is part of a project to introduce new crops to arid and saline areas. However, there are, of course, some problems. For example, a forest growing for 60 years doesn't mean it's completely free of losses. Scientists have found that between 5% and 10% of the forest has withered and died due to a series of extreme droughts in the last decade. And the forest isn't recovering due to ongoing climate problems, as well as grazing by sheep and goats, which eat the pine seedlings. Another problem is based on a simple truth. A tree, however good, isn't always good. The area where Yatier was planted has never been a forest, so the native species are adapted to shrubs. They need open landscapes to move into the sand in search of prey. Furthermore, the heavy machinery and herbicides used when planting trees are bad news for the fragile soil of the drylands, because the bark decomposes and small plants, lichens, fungi, etc. provide food for insects, reptiles, and birds. In short, you get the picture. Everything has its downside. What else can the Negev desert boast about today? Well, for example, the fact that agriculture is actively developing there, although it is generally developing throughout Israel. Israel is one of the most efficient producers of cow's milk, at 13,000 liters per cow, compared to 10,000 liters in North America and 6,000 liters in Europe. The tomato yield in Israel is 300 tons per hectare, compared to the world average of 50 tons per hectare. The country also produces 262 tons of citrus fruit per hectare, compared to 243 in North America and 211 in Europe. In addition, farmers in the Negev grow sunflowers, wheat, melons, chickpeas, pomegranates, almonds, and olives. Okay, if that doesn't surprise you, they even manage to grow cotton, one of the most water-intensive crops you can plant in the desert. Farmers in Sabar Kama even provide some figures. In good years, they harvest 3.5 tons of sunflowers, 7 tons of wheat, and 6.5 tons of cotton. Doesn't seem like much? We're talking about yields per hectare, so the numbers are quite decent. And here's the total value of fruit production in each country. It's like GDP, only broken down for agriculture. So Israel is in first place, followed by Pakistan, Portugal, and New Zealand, even though these countries have a much larger land area than Israel. Everyone else on the list also has a larger area, but it's the total area that matters. Israel is a country where more than half of the land area is the Negev desert, arid, harsh, and everything else. Yet, it is in this southern desert where 40% of the country's agriculture is concentrated. How do the Israelis manage this? You've probably already realized that the country has a highly developed water system that carries salt-treated water from the Mediterranean Sea to the Negev. In their agricultural sector, Israelis also use groundwater, and then there's wastewater. This too is treated and made usable in the fields, so it ends up in the hands of farmers. But if the water were simply poured into the arid desert, the consumption would be enormous. No system, not even Israel's, could cope with such a task. Agricultural innovation helps to save water. The most important of these is, of course, drip irrigation, which began to become widespread in Israel in the 1950s. Thanks to one of the founders of Mekorot, the country's main water organization. What is the method? In this case, water isn't simply poured over all the beds. The liquid is delivered directly to the root zone of the growing plants in small portions, regulated by drip irrigation systems. This type of irrigation offers numerous advantages, such as low water consumption, reduced erosion, weed control, and much more. There is, of course, a disadvantage: higher costs compared to traditional irrigation methods. However, in the case of Negev agriculture, this disadvantage is less significant, at least because drip irrigation feeds the country and generates income through exports. It is also closely associated with fish farming, which also contributes to the local economy and feeds the population. Yes, there really are fish farms in the desert. A couple of decades ago, scientists discovered that in certain locations beneath the arid zones, at a depth of 15 to 30 meters, there is water with a temperature of 40 degrees Celsius and low salinity. Thousands of years ago, it rained more in the desert region. The water trickled from the sky and then seeped underground, accumulating and heating up. Scientists have since shown that this water creates a perfect environment for aquatic life, including tilapia, bream, barramundi, catfish, millionfish, clownfish, and many other species. These fish aren't just raised for food. They are released into the water, where they release metabolites that are highly nutritious for plants. This enriched water can then be used to grow crops. Throughout their lives, the plants absorb these metabolites through their roots, purifying the water and returning it almost to its original state. In short, a closed cycle. Here, for example, there is an industrial fish farm in the Negev desert with a production capacity of 2,000 tons of barramundi per year. It is located on 35 hectares of land above a 37-degree geothermal water source. The internal systems are pumped, then the barramundi fish are cultivated, and a small amount of water is discharged off-site, thus beginning its use in agriculture. Through a special system, the water is reused to irrigate nearby olive groves. Let's recall David Ben-Gurion again. He hoped that the low-lying desert region of the country would eventually help the north with desalination and renewable energy. With desalination, it does help the south because studies have already shown that this water can be used in arid regions. Moreover, Ben-Gurion could hardly have imagined that Israeli technology would be used worldwide. And what about energy? In this respect, the Negev desert is helpful because it receives enormous amounts of solar heat and has large unoccupied areas, ideal for solar energy projects. And here's a good example. The Asalim power plant, located south of Beersheba, the most populated city in the Negev desert, consists of 3 sites with 3 different technologies. The first is a 121 megawatt parabolic trough solar power plant. Here, an array of reflectors concentrates the sun's rays onto a heat pipe. The thermal energy from this system can be stored for 4.5 hours. The second site features 50,600 of these devices, which are heliostats that concentrate the sun's rays onto a collector tower. Each one automatically adjusts to the sun's position to reflect the optimal amount of sunlight, resulting in an annual production of 320 gigawatt hours of energy. And now for the record. Until recently, this 260-meter-tall tower was the tallest of its kind in the world. But this is of little consequence to the residents of the surrounding countryside and the farmers who work the fields. For them, there is a much more significant fact. The plant produces 320 gigawatt hours of energy annually, enough to power 120,000 homes and provide ample energy for agriculture. The third site is a photovoltaic platform that doesn't impress with its figures compared to its counterparts, as it only has a capacity of 30 megawatts. However, it is an additional source of energy for both residents and the greening of the Negev desert. Yes, it was as if Ben-Gurion had glimpsed the future when he stated that the Negev would be a test of Israel's creativity and innovative energy. He didn't know to what extent Israel would pass that test. However, it can now be said that the country is doing very well.